How did an Army officer so associated with George Washington's legacy go to war against what we today consider George Washington's greatest legacy, the Union? It was this question that ultimately drew me to Robert E. Lee's story. And it's that tragic tension and the knowledge that history could have turned out so much differently. Because on the eve of the Civil War, leaders on both sides of the Potomac, in Richmond and in Washington, sought Lee's services for high command. Both knew about his connections to George Washington. That was common knowledge. And both saw tremendous significance in them. They also knew that Winfield Scott, who at that time was the ranking general in the U.S. Army, thought Lee was the very best soldier he had ever seen in the field. And Robert E. Lee certainly looked like a fine soldier. He stood just under 6 feet tall. He had powerful, broad shoulders. He had a barreled chest. He had perfect posture. Everybody who saw him said some version of the same thing. That man looks every inch the soldier. And so in April 1861, an emissary for Abraham Lincoln asks Robert E. Lee to ride across from Arlington and come to the city of Washington. That emissary's name is Francis Blair, and he makes an extraordinary offer to Robert E. Lee. He says, will you lead the main Union Army to crush secession? And as Lee remembered the story, Blair tried in every way to convince Robert E. Lee to say yes. Blair said to Lee, the country looks to you, quote, as the representative of the Washington family to save the Union George Washington forged. And that was hardly an exaggeration, because here, after all, was the son of George Washington's most famous eulogist and the son-in-law of George Washington's adopted child. And so now only one word separated Robert E. Lee from the pinnacle of his profession, from command of what would be the largest American army ever raised, from glory, perhaps, that no American since George Washington had known. And what did Robert E. Lee say? Well, he said he opposed secession, and he did oppose secession. He thought secession was illegal. And equally significantly, he thought George Washington would have opposed secession. And that was no given at the time, because people on both sides of this conflict claimed George Washington for their own. Secessionists say George Washington was a rebel who rebelled against a union with the British. On the other side, Unionists will say George Washington, in his farewell address, said to prize the Union above any sectional allegiance. And actually, Robert E. Lee is reading a biography of George Washington in the months before the Civil War. And he's hearing these arguments, and he concludes that he basically agrees with the Unionist position. He believes that George Washington would have opposed secession. So what else does Lee say to Francis Blair? He says that he would gladly wash his hands of slavery. He would gladly get rid of all of slavery if it could avoid war. But then he says, but how can I raise my sword against my native state? And here, Blair family tradition says Lee hesitated as if searching for an answer. But as Lee told the story, he gave the answer once and at once, no. He turned down the command, though he did not yet turn in his commission in the army he had served for more than 3 decades. He returns to Arlington House. He soon learns that Virginia, in fact, has voted to secede from the Union. And there on April 20th, he writes a letter resigning from the Union Army. And his wife would call that decision to resign the severest struggle of his life.